And when I got the call and was asked to do the keynote for this, I was very excited. My ego kind of took over, and I was like, yeah, brilliant, great. I'm so flattered. That's going to be awesome. I get to keynote. And then about 10 minutes later after the call, I was like, oh, what am I going to talk about? I have no research to hide behind in a keynote. I have to have something interesting or motivational or something to inspire people. So we'll start with some classic keynote cheese. A good quote. But seriously, this, I suppose, is what Troopers has been all about for me. It's about igniting my mind, making me think about things, not necessarily just learning and regurgitating, but actually making me want to do research, making me want to find out more, making me more curious. I know Plutarch was a Greek philosopher from, I think, the 1st century AD. Gabe can probably correct me. He may know. So today, I'm hoping that I can just ignite your mind. I'm trying to return the favor. But basically, if I can generate any emotion in you at all, I'll be quite happy. As long as you're not sleeping, that's good. Some of you, maybe half of you, maybe all of you will violently disagree with what I'm about to say. That's good. That's what I want. Hopefully some of you agree, but we can talk about that at the end as well. So this is the smelly cheese. This is the blue cheese. This is the stuff that takes a while to be able to swallow. So my last generation view of information security, having been in it for about 15 or more years, basically we have completely failed to create any meaningful change in the behavior of people. And I'm speaking for experience, so this includes me. I've been to many conferences, I've given lots of talks. But I've really failed to make any material impact on the security of the world. That's what I think. I've worked in the security industry for a long time. I've penetration tested people. I've delivered reports detailing all their flaws. I've had a great time, especially here. Made lots of friends, listened to great talks. But there's something wrong with the way we're communicating to the wider population about security issues. So as this is next generation, I'm hoping that the next generation internet can fix that. And we need to take a new approach to how we communicate ideas about security and what the impact of bad security on people is. So this is my starting point. I need to go back in time, even though it's next gen, to talk about why I think this is true. So 30 years ago, this gentleman, Robert Morris, became the first individual in the world to be tried under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. He was prosecuted for basically creating the Morris worm, as it's now called. He got 3 years probation, 400 hours of community service. He got fined $10,000, and he had to pay for the cost of his supervision. So the Morris worm, as some of you probably know, had a couple of exploits in it. One of them was a buffer overflow in FingerD, an old Unix service. And it also had a dictionary of passwords that it used to try and propagate as well. So it had multiple vectors. There was also a sendmail exploit in there as well. But basically overflows plus known weak passwords 30 years ago. Here's what I was doing 30 years ago. This is me last generation. I was, before I got into security, I was a street performer, a comedy juggler for 10 years. Some of the people in the room know this, many don't. And certainly this is before internet, this is before color, clearly. I actually got bored as a kid. I had nothing to do sometimes. I was a teenager without social media. But street performing taught me quite a few things. If you want to be a successful street performer, first of all, you have to be able to make people stop. You have to make them change what they're doing. You have to approach strangers in the street and persuade them to stand still for some period of time. You have to make them feel something, sorry, not someone, So feel something, happiness, excitement, fear, relief, whatever it might be. And key is you need to try to make everyone act as one. So as you build these little relationships, short relationships with people while you're building a crowd, once you reach a critical mass, rather than talking to the individuals, you are now talking to the herd, the crowd. This is key. So you get this emergent property of the crowd, which makes doing your show much easier. And if you do all those three things, you make someone stop, you make them feel something, and you make them feel something that benefits them. That's pretty crucial. It's not, they don't want to feel bad, obviously. And you can make them all act as one, then you can persuade them at the end to give you money. So I spent 10 years doing this, traveled around the world, Canada, Australia, Europe, South America, and I had a great time. So let's jump forward to 10 years after Morris, 1998. This gentleman is Rainforest Puppy. So he was the first researcher to publish and explain SQL injection, so attacking databases, extracting information by abusing unvalidated input. So untrusted input, basically much easier than buffer overflow, but fundamentally the same concept, taking input, trusting it implicitly, and processing it. So both of those flaws result from the same blind trust that people shouldn't have. Obviously, SQL injection, much simpler than buffer overflow, much easier to attack. But basically, from 1988 to 1998, we have the growth of all the web technologies, and we discover that the same mistakes that were there in 1988, which at least we had an excuse then, it was very new, are still there in 98 when we're building web technologies and next generation internet at that time, the .com boom. We were always next generation coming up, still making the same mistakes. So 10 years of basically untrusted input being abused. And we understood it then, we understood it now, we do understand it now, still making the same mistakes. 1998, this is what I was doing, still playing around with balls. I had a ponytail, that wasn't a good year, so we'll skip that. And we got up to 2008. So, what happened in 2008? Anyone remember anything that happened in 2008? 10 years ago, doesn't seem like that. We had Conficker. So, at this point, hacking had really become fully embraced by organized crime. So, the creators of Conficker are basically faceless. Nobody's claiming it. Nobody's doing it to be known as someone who's created Conficker. There's far too much money to be made from running Conficker as for criminals or nation states or whoever it might be. So what was Conficker? Conficker was another overflow, untrusted input, MS08067, NetBIOS overflow. So another 10 years has gone by, another 10 years of people like me standing up at conferences, getting drunk and telling people about untrusted input, and everybody nodding sagely and going, yes, terrible, terrible, those stupid users, those stupid system administrators, oh my God, why don't they listen? Now, another interesting fact about Conficker, which was less, a bunch of you will have researched it and will know, but it also, to propagate, also used dictionary attacks on $admin shares on Windows. So, again, it was trying to look for weak passwords. Again, weak passwords. Same as Morris. Buffer overflow, weak passwords, 20 years later, still doing the same old stuff, still very successful, and we're still standing up here banging on about it, and nobody is listening, nobody's changing, and we're blaming them. So, 2008, this is me. I have made the transition from comedy juggler to trusted security professional. And I would just like to say that is not my real hair in this picture. I have had some silly haircuts. That is a wig, just in case anybody's wondering. Why did I put that picture up? That's appalling. It's very big. So unbelievably, at this point, I'm one of the founders and owners of a penetration testing company in New Zealand. I was a technical head. I've been running research programs. I was published in FRAC. I've talked at Black Hat. I'm starting to speak at Troopers. Everything's going great. I'm basically a penetration testing consultant. I get engaged to test people's networks, to review their designs, review their software, review their systems, review their architecture. I'm getting paid, I'm doing research, and then I'm delivering reports of all these security problems that I'm so happy to have found and make me feel really good. And I'm discovering that when I deliver these reports, the clients and the customers, they go through the 5 stages of grief, basically. Initially, there's denial, complete denial. Oh, no, our devs, oh, we wouldn't do that. This is ridiculous. This is, nonsense. No, you must be wrong. You must be wrong. Deliver some proof, and then they get angry. Second stage is anger. It's like, oh, well, I think you've overstepped the scope, and you shouldn't have been looking at this system. And oh, no, we didn't ask you to do that. And what you exploited it. Why did you do that? And then they come to bargaining, where they start to talk about what they might be able to do to fix it, even though I don't, at this point, care. I am the security guy. They talk about how to fix it. Then they get quite depressed because they realize all the work they're going to have to do and all the money they're going to have to spend. And then there's finally acceptance, where they accept that they have made all these mistakes. But I was doing this again and again and again. I was delivering reports to the same people year after year. Finding the same things, telling them the same problems, and they weren't changing their behavior. So at this point, I was blaming them. I was saying, well, they're clearly stupid. They're not listening. How obvious do I have to be? I was having a great time. I met smart people, made some friends. Some of them were in the room. Made some more friends at some other conferences. Let's not talk about him. And this one, I think, Sergey on the right here, I think he's actually looking depressed because me and Dmitry have very large glasses of wine and Sergey has nothing. So, and I think as a Russian, that's an untenable position to be in. So, 20 years. So another 10 years go by. That's very fast, a long time, 30 years. So 30 years after Morris, what have we got? This is now. So 2017, we had WannaCry. What was that? Oh, that was an overflow in unpatched Windows. Old Windows, an overflow again. What's an overflow? Untrusted input, that's right. Yeah, that's new, isn't it? Yeah. And just before that, so this gentleman, I think he's about to be sentenced this month. This is Paras Jha from the States, and he's facing conspiracy charges with some others for developing Mirai, the next generation internet botnet, which, what did it use? It used known common default passwords to propagate. It didn't even bother with an overflow, it didn't need one. It just used passwords. And in fact, Mirai itself is vulnerable to an overflow, which is kind of ironic. And Paras here is looking at maybe 5 years in prison, $250,000 fine, a few years of supervised release. Same problem, same issues, overflows, untrusted input, weak passwords, not rocket science, not that clever. So did the manufacturers of these devices suffer in any way? I'm not sure they did. And the other interesting thing, I think, is that WannaCry, Conficker, Mirai, Morris, they're all pretty much invisible to the public. To the wider population, these attacks are things they read about, but they don't experience them firsthand. They hear about them, but they don't actually experience them. So this leads to this idea that it will never happen to them. This is why people have weak passwords. It will never happen to them. It's like car crashes, plane crashes, taking drugs, smoking cigarettes, drinking too much. It's not going to happen to me. And this is called optimism bias. It's a known psychological property of people, I guess. But I think the fact that sorry, I pressed the wrong button by mistake there briefly. So the fact that these attacks are invisible is a real problem for changing people's behavior. And this is me now. So this is me. Now, guess what I do now? Now I'm a defender. This is why I look like this. So basically, I now have a company that helps people defend themselves because I became very frustrated with attacking people. It was fun, don't get me wrong, I enjoyed it, but I really wasn't making any change. And what I've come to realize is that it's not the people receiving the news that have the problem. It's the way I've been delivering this information to them. It's the way I've been trying to explain to them what they need to do and how they need to do it. That is fundamentally the problem. So at all these conferences, we stand up and we talk and we understand and we get it, but the other people don't. But that isn't their fault. That's because of the way we're explaining it. And I think, so I've completely failed to make the world more secure or safer, which is what Troopers is all about. And I think that's true for the InfoSec industry as a whole. I think it's completely failed to make the world more secure. So that's my opinion. Let's look at some graphs. This is my favorite slide, the first time I've done any animation. It's my keynote. I'm pretty super excited about that. It took me a while to find that, actually. I didn't Google it. I did just trawl through the menus. So, number of vulnerabilities in the world over years. So 1997 on the left, 2018 on the right. Obviously, we're early in 2018, but yeah, more vulnerabilities. This is the National Vulnerability Database in the States. CV details, another vulnerability database. So we have a bit of a dip there in maybe the mid 210s, but nothing particularly significant. So more and more vulnerabilities every year are found. So here's another way of looking at that information. The blue line is the important one. More and more vulnerabilities every year. So this is what we do. This is what the InfoSec industry is all about. We find vulnerabilities, we categorize them, we assign them scores, we work out the likelihood, or when I say work out the likelihood, I say we make it up. We have no idea what the likelihood of someone exploiting it is. The attacker decides that. He decides whether to attack you. It's not a statistic like an accident. It's not like getting in a plane and working out, looking at years and years of data. We don't know. We don't know the likelihood of being compromised. We then decide how difficult it is for us or someone else. I don't know. How do you decide the difficulty? For whom? And then we also decide what the impact of those vulnerabilities is, which is quite mind-blowing because that's what the attacker does, don't they? Do they not decide what happens when they exploit you? I don't know. So we have CVS scores. We build scanners to find these vulnerabilities. Whenever a new vulnerability comes out, there's a new scanner, a new scan tool to discover this vulnerability, so we can add it to the taxonomy, and we can keep building these collections of vulnerabilities that we can polish like turds, and we wheel them out on drawers. Companies have risk registers of these things, and every time they have to add a new one, they pull out their drawer and they look at their collection, and they decide where to put this new one they have in the collection, and they might rearrange the other ones and polish them up a bit, and then they close the drawer again, and everyone goes back to work. Discovering vulnerabilities is not the problem. Talking about new vulnerabilities is not the problem. There's, I think, in CVE, there's something like almost 100,000 vulnerabilities categorized, which is interesting because most are from, I guess, a few flaws, trusting untrustworthy input. But we categorize them into all sorts of clever things. Like we break them down, we reduce them. We have different categories for web application vulnerabilities versus client-side software vulnerabilities. It just goes on and on. So classifying and discovering them is not the problem, but that's really fundamentally what we spend a lot of our time doing. So maybe I'm wrong though. We have all these vulnerabilities, but maybe InfoSec's working. Maybe even though we have lots more vulnerabilities, we're not being exploited. Wrong. So breaches over the last 5 years. This is quite hard information to find, but and I think we probably intuitively know this from the number of reports of breaches. So this is over the last 5 years. Breaches going up and up. So we're not succeeding. We're not stopping people being compromised at all. So what is our response as InfoSec industry been? Shaming vendors and suppliers. We do that a little bit. Are we attempting to communicate security to the wider public? Maybe a little bit. Are we doing it right? I don't think so. But fundamentally, what we do is we keep finding more and more vulnerabilities. And we've now changed from, so last generation, when I first got into security, the way we found out about vulnerabilities was called full disclosure. It still exists. There's a mailing list. People would find things, they would just publish them to everyone, so everyone knew. And that's changed latterly, because apparently that is irresponsible. And now we have responsible disclosure. Now, I have an issue with responsible disclosure. Who is it responsible to? To whom is it responsible? And I think with next generation internet, if you have all this ubiquitous computing embedded in the wider world, are you being responsible if you tell the vendor first and not anyone else? Are we being responsible to the vendor or to the wider population? I think responsible disclosure is based on the false premise that that individual researcher who has found it and disclosed it is the smartest researcher for that issue, and no one else knows about it. I think that's false. I think science, the wider science, proves that that's false. We had way back Newton and Leibniz both discovering calculus. There are numerous examples of people discovering the same thing at the same time or almost the same time. And certainly in our world now, where there's so much money to be made from exploiting vulnerabilities, why would the attackers ever publish what they knew before anyone else? So is responsible disclosure not just extending the time the attacker has and not letting the people who are actually potentially suffering from the vulnerability to take some kind of action? Shouldn't you know if something is not safe to use as soon as possible? In any other industry, if I discover a flaw, say in my car brakes, under certain conditions they fail to work, do I go and tell the manufacturer first to give him time to fix it so he doesn't look so bad and let people have crashes? I don't think so. And not only did we go from full disclosure, which actually wasn't really full disclosure, it was very technical disclosure to a small group of people who read full disclosure, or a larger number of people, but not the wider public. It's full disclosure to the community, but not really full disclosure in a meaningful communicative sense to the world. But we moved to a whole new business. We invented a whole new business model of bug bounties. We have BugCrowd and HackerOne now. So we found all these vulnerabilities. We have these piles of them sitting around, so why don't we get paid to tell people about them? Even better. So let's not bother about changing behavior or fixing the problem. Let's just make more money from telling people about more vulnerabilities. That's a great idea. So we can wrap it up as responsible disclosure and bug bounties, and we can feel good about it. But it doesn't make the world any safer. It doesn't help anyone. It helps the vendors. Although I would say if you've ever subscribed to a bug bounty program, you get a lot of reports of vulnerabilities that are not vulnerabilities. Anyway, that's another talk. So I think the incentive in InfoSec at the present time is to keep finding problems, give talks, collect bounties, rinse and repeat. So my question is, it's next generation internet. Do you actually want to make the world a safer place? Or do you want to keep giving talks at conferences? So that's what I'm keynoting about, so we should talk about next generation internet. So hopefully I've convinced you that our approach of the last 30 years in last generation is not working. This next generation internet, I mean, this is now all the embedded software and hardware is going to be deployed in the world. It's going to be ubiquitous. It's going to be everywhere. People who didn't necessarily choose or understand any of that technology are going to be subject to it, and it will be insecure. It will be. There is no question about that. We're not going to make next generation internet secure before it happens. It will be insecure. So I think next gen has to learn from the past. If you're going to have this new technology, billions of connected devices, we are going to have to do something different. So, fundamentally our approach of saying, don't use that functionality that you want to use because it's dangerous. Don't click on links. Don't click on links. That's advice. Don't click on links. Have you used the internet? That's fundamentally how it works. Telling the wider population to not click on links is insane. No wonder people don't listen to us. It's ludicrous. It's ludicrous. It makes no sense. So that approach does not work. I put up the slide. It doesn't connect to my talk at all, apart from it. It's really old, and it's talking about emoticons. I thought that's hilarious. So it's kind of next gen, old gen, I suppose. But you can read it. It's pretty funny. I particularly like astonishment. I think that's really good. So the behavior we want to change in people, in my view, comes down to these two things. I talked about implicitly trusting input and weak passwords. So implicitly trusting input, and this is not limited to developers. This is just people. Is blind trust. Probably because it benefits you in some way, or you think there's some benefit by just trusting. You get something you want. And optimism bias. So just people generally being insecure. And maybe I should have a quick poll. Who in this room has ever used a really shit password and knew it was really shit but used it anyway? Look at that. That's optimism bias right there. Yeah? Well, it's not going to happen to us. Sorry?
No, that's pen testing.
It's pen testing. Well, it won't happen to me. It's I can get away with this. I know what I'm doing. It's fine. And it's just one system, and I'll change it in a little while, like in 5 years when I appear on Troy Hunt's I've been pwned list. Oh shit. So these are the two things we have to change. So that's not too bad. Two things. We can change two things, can't we? So, there's one thing I did want to point out on this slide. It's quite small, but so this is an actual product that existed, X-ray soap, and on the right it says cleans everything, hurts nothing. So, blind trust and optimism bias right there. So how do you go about changing these behaviors? So this is another picture of me with stupid hair. And you might notice this is actually Heidelberg. So I actually gave shows in Heidelberg a long time ago before I ever came to Troopers. And that is my next generation when she was really little. She was really cute then as well, not so much now. Actually, just after this picture was taken, a lovely resident in Heidelberg dressed in lederhosen threatened to kill me. Fortunately, my optimism bias was true in that case, and I was fine. So I was worried about my daughter, as the internet came about using the internet. Should I censor? Should I control? Should I turn stuff off? How do you go about changing the behavior or educating your children about the internet without just turning stuff off and telling them not to click on links and not letting them use things? Because clearly that's not sustainable. So basically, I played pranks on her. So when she was growing up and using her computer, I would use VNC to remotely control the computer and pretend the computer was chatting to her, typing messages in Notepad. I would use text to voice so that when she logged in, a few minutes after login, the computer would say something to her, something maybe creepy or strange. And basically, I managed to change her approach to how she would use computers in general. And obviously, we talked about stuff as well. She knew I was playing pranks on her eventually. And I think if you can change her a critical mass of individuals, you can, just like in a street show, you can eventually change the majority behavior. The emergent crowd property comes out. So, we need to make certain behaviors culturally unacceptable. A bit like, seatbelts in cars, for example. When I was growing up, we could sit in the back. The only people who had to wear a seatbelt were people in the front. You could be a child in the back seat rolling around. You didn't need a seatbelt. It's all safe. Everything's fine. And then that simply became unacceptable. It's not so much that people understood or intellectually decided that all the children should wear seatbelts. It just became something that you had to do. And that's what we need to do with security. So how does that translate to everyone in this room, to everyone here? So I'm proposing a new form of disclosure. I have a manifesto. I will present that shortly. And my new form of disclosure is partly inspired by this man, George M, I'm going to call him, because I can't pronounce his second name. He's the founder and coordinator of a movement called Fluxus, which was from 1962. It was a global collective of artists, musicians. It included composers, designers, architects, economists, mathematicians, ballet dancers, chefs, theologians. They were basically questioning the art establishment. They were all open to experimentation, innovation. They were known for generating new art forms like concept art. They invented that, video art, and they created their art in really performance events. So they rejected traditional galleries, performance spaces. So my proposal is, we could call it artistic disclosure. So in next generation internet, when you find vulnerabilities, I want to challenge you. And I want to make you think, how can you present this information in a way that makes people question their blind trust, their optimism bias? How can you communicate that vulnerability in a way they experience? So they experience it, they have to experience it emotionally. You can't just tell them technical details and flaws. You have to make them, you have to make the experience relevant to them. So you have to make them experience something. Prove their optimism bias false by making something happen to them. That will make them question their trust. And interestingly, this form of disclosure, I've got a couple of examples that I've done, will get the flaw fixed much faster than our current regime of responsible disclosure and bug bounties as well. So check out Fluxus. It's an interesting movement that existed. So here's an example of artistic disclosure. So a few years ago, 2014, I was working with a colleague, Vladimir Wollstonecroft. We're giving a talk tomorrow. He's presented here at Troopers a few times. And he had found a flaw in Snapchat, which meant you could send a snap to yourself without authentication. So if you knew the username, you could send a snap to that username and it would appear on his phone or her phone that it had come from themselves, and you required no authentication. And around this time, there'd been a large leak out of the Snapchat user database of usernames, I think related to Facebook. I can't remember exactly, but we had tens of thousands, I think close to 100,000 Snapchat usernames, maybe more, in a database. So he had found this flaw, and he came to me. We'd been working together a little bit, but he hadn't done much research, and he was interested in claiming a bug bounty. I persuaded him not to collect the bug bounty, to actually do something else, and also to give a talk. I believe he came to Troopers and gave a talk about this as well. So I persuaded him that he could get a talk, and that would be better for his career than some paltry bug bounty from Snapchat, and that also we could maybe do something different. So we constructed basically a tool that would rip through the database. We constructed this image, so emergency broadcast system image, claiming there was a zombie outbreak in progress. If you go to these URLs, there's still some comments about this. We attempted to send this to everybody we could who was a Snapchat user, just to see what would happen. So we started quite late one night on a Saturday, possibly after drinking too much. And by 6 a.m. on Sunday morning, the flaw was fixed. So in that intervening period, there was a bunch of tweets started appearing. Some people were posting about what the hell, I woke up, because some of them were in the US. I've got this message from myself, and somebody tweeted at Snapchat, and the flaw was silently fixed in hours, even though it was a Sunday in the US. So we marked down that as a win. We'd have liked to have sent more. I think we hit about 50,000 people we sent it to. But that, I think, hopefully achieved the two things I was talking about. It made people experience the security flaw directly. Some of them then contacted Snapchat. That fix was then done. And it made them question their trust to some extent, or their blind trust in their devices. And I don't think we hurt anyone, so I take that as a win. The next example, this is Vladimir and myself did some joint research on Uber in 2016, and we presented here. This was potential, and I'm not sure, maybe I regret not doing things with it. Our research on Uber enabled us to basically build bot users for free and book rides. And we discussed what we could maybe do like Snapchat with this. Could we move cars? Could we name all the bots certain things to send messages to drivers? Lots of interesting scope. At the end of the day, we didn't. We made the decision that moving cars may have a detrimental effect on people, on drivers, on income. So we didn't. I think maybe we should have, though. I don't know, but certainly lots of scope. And this is more next gen for me. This is the physical world being controllable by the software world. And I think we maybe could have done something, and maybe we still can with some artistic disclosure in Uber. So I've summarized this rambling keynote into a manifesto of sorts. I wasn't sure what to call it. Whose manifesto? So one of my good friends once called me an evil imp. I actually looked up imp after he called me that on Wikipedia, and it describes imps as small, fair enough, bony, I'll take that, unattractive, faces are frequently twisted into a smirk or grimace, and they walk with an unpleasant hunch. So I took away evil and I took away the hunch. So I have my imps manifesto for next generation internet. So imps are human, imps are hackers, imps are artists. Every human has rights, every hacker has power, and every artist has responsibilities. So through sensors, robots, actuators, and computers, the cyber world is becoming embedded into and inseparable from the physical world. The machines that will affect this change are comprised of software and hardware that are designed and built without rigorous consideration of potential vulnerabilities in those systems. This is a threat to everyone regardless of their ability to understand or address those vulnerabilities. And current InfoSec approaches have fundamentally failed over 30 years to address these issues. So responsible disclosure is not responsible to everyone. Full disclosure is not communication to everyone. It is my right as a human to be aware of vulnerabilities, and it is within my power as a hacker to find vulnerabilities, and it is my responsibility as an artist to communicate my knowledge to every other human in a meaningful way. So disclose vulnerabilities in a creative fashion. Disclose to everyone simultaneously. Create art from weird machines wherever you find them. Make security art. Be an imp. And don't take yourself too seriously. Thank you.